thumbs up if they can hear me.
Yes, I guess we could go. We have 22 participants, which includes you and me.
Okay. And people can hear me, correct?
Yep.
Uh,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. So we'll be proceeding in the same format as we did last week. Uh, I'll be making some introductory remarks which are intended to frame the discussion of Chapter 1 of Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth. Those remarks will be relatively brief. I think they'll run about 8 minutes. And then we'll immediately plunge into the discussion questions, which are posted both on my website and they're also posted in the Slack channel. And once we get to the discussion questions, I'll be calling upon people. I'm going to first try to call upon people who I see in the Zoom room, but who did not speak last week, either because they passed or because um, they weren't in attendance last week. And we'll try to we'll encourage you to take your best shot at answering the questions. We'll uh, coach each other to try to get an improved version of the response, um, if that's appropriate, and then we'll proceed and we will uh, we can have time for, if there's time at the end of our 90 minutes, we can open up for general discussion. Okay, so these remarks are intended to provide context for Chapter 1 of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. And Chapter 1 is entitled, Don't Think of a Household. Today, we discuss the central obstacle to a clear understanding of the role which federal government spending and taxation play in the political economy of the United States, the so called household budget analogy. The household budget analogy argues that federal spending and taxation work in the same way that an individual household's budgeting of income and expenditures works, only at much greater scale. Any individual household needs to accumulate funds before it can spend. In what politicians will typically describe as a, quote, hardworking American family, close quote, these funds can be accumulated, broadly speaking, in one of three ways. They can be inherited, they can be borrowed, they can be earned by having household members go into the labor market and sell their ability to work for wages or salaries. Whichever way it's done, the household has to amass currency before it can spend that currency on the goods and services it needs to survive. The currency does not come from within the family, it originates somewhere outside the family. The family is merely a currency user. In a typical discussion of households, we ignore inherited funds. So the question of family budgeting reduces to the question, can the family meet its spending targets solely from its earned income, or must the family resort to borrowing to do so? If the family borrows to maintain its consumption targets, it incurs obligations to make interest payments to its lenders and ultimately to repay the principal on those loans. Having to take on debt places the family's long-term financial stability in question. In our society, taking on debt means that the family is taking on a certain degree of social stigma as well. Like households, businesses must also amass funds before they can spend. These funds can come from sales or perhaps from borrowing. So businesses are currency users just like households. However, when a business takes on debt, it is usually less stigmatized than a household is. Business spending done with borrowed funds can usually be characterized as investment spending, which will presumably lead to increased profits in the future. How about state and local governments? Must they amass funds before they can spend? Yes, they must amass funds by raising revenue, such as taxation and fees, or by borrowing before they can spend. How they raise revenue and what restrictions exist on their borrowing are strictly limited by law. In the United States, state and local governments don't have the ability to create currency, so they are currency users, much as households and businesses are. Households, businesses, and state and local governments are all currency users. They all have to amass funds before they can spend. Funds in the form of currency which originates someplace else. Households, businesses, and state and local governments all have to engage in a budgeting process which balances income and spending over some period of time. Well, how about the US federal government? Does it have to amass funds before it can spend? Is the federal government a currency user like households, businesses, and state and local governments? Does the federal government face the same budgetary constraints that households, businesses, and state and local governments do? The answer to each of these questions is no. And here we come to the central insight of modern money theory. The US federal government is not like a household. It does not have to amass funds before it can spend. It creates the currency in the very act of spending it. It is a currency issuer, not a currency user. There are a number of implications of this which will at first seem very startling to you. Then, as you understand MMT, these implications will all appear as common sense. Let's just mention one of them now. If the federal government does not need to amass funds before it can spend, then it doesn't need to tax or borrow before it spends. That means that taxation and federal debt sales must have purposes other than financing the federal government or finding the money which the government then spends. To cite just one of those purposes right now, if the currency is created in the process of spending dollars into the economy, then the currency is destroyed when those dollars are withdrawn from the economy via taxation or borrowing. If you're encountering these ideas for the first time, they will seem startling, or at least counterintuitive. They certainly contradict the conventional wisdom. Recall the first of the three phrases that I mentioned in last week's introductory remarks. What does happen? MMT argues that the way the economy actually works is very different from the way described in orthodox economics textbooks or in conventional wisdom. And that's particularly true for the way federal government budgeting and spending works. Let's now turn to our discussion questions for Chapter 1 of Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, the chapter titled, Don't Think of a Household. So, as was the case last week, if you haven't been able to do the reading and do not want to hazard a guess at the answer when I call upon you, just say pass, we'll go on to the next person. If you have done the reading, please try to take a stab at the answer. And, if there are imperfections, we'll try to improve them and we'll get, we'll get feedback from each other. And as I mentioned, I'm going to begin, I'm going to go through my Zoom window. I'm going to first call upon people who I believe did not speak last week. So, the first question is explain the difference between a government, which is a currency issuer, and one which is a currency user. And I'd like to call upon Peter Lugton. Peter, can you take a stab at this question?
A government which is a currency issuer versus a currency user.
Yes.
So, well, a currency issuer being able to issue the currency um, means that it doesn't have to, as you said, borrow or tax in order to spend. It is going to spend according to what it feels important to spend money on, and it's not limited by how much reserves it has in a bank someplace. It is, in fact, limited more by whether this creates inflationary pressures.
Okay, very
Whereas
good.
the currency user has um, doesn't have the ability to print money and or um, well, yeah, print money. So it has to balance the budget, and it can only either obtain money through taxation or borrow money. And if it spends more money than it has in receipts, it is therefore running at a deficit, which then it legally is obliged to make up for,
Okay,
usually.
very good. Let me just ask an extension of that question. I'm going to look at Oliver Liu. Uh, can you give us an example, name an example of a currency using level of government and one which is and one which is a currency issuer level of government?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said. I mean, the state, like the state of New York, is a user, but the federal government is a issuer.
Okay. Would you say that the Kingdom of the Netherlands is a currency issuer or a currency user?
I would say a user because they use the euro, but they
Correct.
participate in the. I mean, they have some say in it.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Uh, is anyone else who wants to add anything to this question, or is not clear?
Well, there is a question that I've seen raised as to whether banks are currency issuers, because when they extend a loan, they create a deposit account and uh, give money to a business that then spends it on whatever it needs to spend. So is that creating money in the same way that a government would create money?
I'd say it is creating money. We'll actually be getting to the role of banks. Um, Not so much in this session, but in future sessions. The One of the main points to think about is that banks are basically licensed by the government. So one of the ways in which some uh, people who do MMT look at banks is that they're a public-private franchise uh, that extends the money creating power of the government. Uh, I don't want to say anything more than that because we could very easily go down a rabbit hole, and we're going to discuss that in coming weeks.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Uh, okay. The next question that I'd like to pose is that is what are the conditions which, per Stephanie Kelton's discussion, a country must meet in order to be monetarily sovereign? What are the conditions to be met for monetary sovereignty? And let's see, I'm going to try to call upon people who did not speak last week, but who are present this week. Uh, let's see. Bonnie, can you take a stab at that question?
I knew you were going to call on me on that thing. That sounds like a question from last week. But
It is. The question of monetary sovereignty is so important that it will be part of the discussion questions in 3 of our 6 weeks.
I didn't review last week, unfortunately. I just read chapter 1. But in order to have a currency sovereignty, you'd have to issue your own currency. The government would have to be the issuer of its own currency.
Okay.
Obviously.
Oh,
So that's part of it. And it gets much more complicated than that, of course. But it's the government that would have to be the issuer of the currency. I'm trying to think. It gets much more complicated.
yes, you have correctly identified one of the conditions of monetary sovereignty, namely that the government, at least as presented here by Stephanie Kelton, namely that the government has the exclusive right to issue the currency, or we might say that it's the monopoly issuer of the currency. But she identifies 2 other conditions to have monetary sovereignty, and let's see if we can have someone else take a stab at one of the other conditions for monetary sovereignty. David Johnson, would you like to take a stab at that?
Sure. I believe the second condition is that sovereign money issuer has to only use that currency in its dealings with other countries.
Okay. Can you be? Kelton is a bit more specific about those dealings with other countries. Can you be a bit more precise about that?
Well, in terms of trade, I would say.
Well, I would think that, like, let's say the United States and Great Britain, they both are monetarily sovereign countries.
Yeah.
But sometimes they're going to use dollars in their trade. Sometimes they're going to use pound sterling in their trade. So trade per se is not the issue here. But I think you're close to an answer.
Yeah, I can't be any clearer on that. I need to get better understanding of it myself at this point.
Okay. Let's see. Let's go on. We'll ask someone else to amplify that answer. Let's see. I'm probably going to mispronounce his name. Uslam OK.
He said pass in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Joe Polito. If Joe Polito.
Hi.
Yes. Can you identify one of the conditions for another of the conditions for monetary sovereignty?
Well, I think what you were just driving at was the fact that people or the countries need only pay their debts back in their own currency.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct. And the fact that they do not borrow in currencies
that
they do not issue.
Yeah.
So that is correct. So now we've identified 2 of the conditions for monetary sovereignty, which Kelton mentions in this chapter. One being that the government has the exclusive right to issue the currency, and another that the government does no borrowing in foreign currencies. And there's one more condition that she mentions. I'm going to open this up. Would anybody like to identify the other condition that she mentions? Ruth?
Yeah.
I think that the idea is that the country that issues the currency shouldn't fix it to any particular thing like a gold standard or make an agreement with like the European Union did, where they don't have total control over how much currency they can create or not create.
Okay. Can you try to elaborate a bit on why would tying a country's currency to a gold exchange standard limit the country's monetary sovereignty? Why would that be a limitation?
I guess that, for example, gold, I guess it could run out, but its price seems to fluctuate, goes up and down. Its value is not steady in any way. So I don't think it would be a good idea, but I don't know too much about it.
Okay. Okay. There are some countries that have basically pegged the value. Who is speaking? There are some countries.
You have echoes, Jim.
Pardon me?
The echo is coming from your end, I think.
Oh, really? No?
It's your own voice.
Okay.
Okay, looks good now.
All right. There are some countries that have pegged the value of their currencies to the US dollar. Why do you think that would limit their monetary sovereignty? Navarre.
I was going to say that's if it's exchangeable for dollars, and that's the way that presumably that's how they peg it. They say you give us one of our dollars, we'll give you a U.S. dollar. That's almost similar to them holding owing debt in dollars, because their dollars that they're issuing can be used as certificate to redeem for U.S. dollars. So it's like for the same reason that they need to come up with those dollars if somebody demands them. They could run out, and that's why they can't. It's very similar to owing that as a debt.
Yes. If a country, believe to a certain extent, Panama and El Salvador do this, they peg their currencies to the U.S. dollars. That means that the governments always have to have a supply of U.S. dollars on hand to meet demands for people to exchange their currencies. You know, like I forget what probably the colon was the former currency in Panama. The government has to have a supply of dollars on hand, but it can't issue those dollars. Only the U.S. government can issue those dollars. So that means the government would have to be constantly looking to accumulate dollars so that it can meet all demands to exchange it. Okay, so just to wrap up, we've identified 3 factors that Stephanie Kelton identifies as being the criteria for monetary sovereignty. The government has to have exclusive right to issue the currency. The government must make no promise of convertibility of the currency, either into a precious metal or into another foreign currency. And the government must not conduct borrowing in that foreign currency. If a government follows these practices, then we would say it has a high degree of monetary sovereignty. Okay.
Can I ask a question about that? Does
Yes.
that mean before, when we were on the gold standard, we were not in that situation? So until Nixon got rid of the gold standard, even though we couldn't really create our own dollars. Is that because of the gold tie? Is that previous to 1971, let's say? Well, could you have called us a currency creator?
Well, I wouldn't exactly use the term currency creator. We were the U.S. government certainly was a currency issuer. because it issued dollars, Federal Reserve notes, silver certificates, but it did not have as complete a degree of monetary sovereignty as it has today. Uh, and you should, one thing that we also have to bear in mind is that um, being on the gold standard meant different things at different points in history. So that, for example, in, like, let's say in the period 1896 to World War One, it was a true gold standard where the U.S. pledged to uh, meet all gold demands. It was suspended for World War One. It was reinstated after World War One, but collapsed going into the Great Depression. And the Roosevelt administration, for the most part, took the United States off the gold standard between 1933 and 1935, particularly with regard to domestic holdings of gold. In World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Conference, and afterwards we had a situation where it's sometimes called the gold exchange standard. Other countries uh, countries could exchange gold with the U.S. Treasury for $35 an ounce, but you couldn't really use gold in any other setting. So, and that's what was suspended by Nixon in the early 1970s. So the government is currency issuing at all these periods, but it's not necessarily monetarily sovereign because it was fixing an exchange rate with gold.
So, Jim, shall we just assume that the idea of monetarily sovereign only works in a fiat system?
Tell me what you mean by fiat currency.
Well, that
fiat
would be a currency that is issued just by the will of the government, where there is no requirements that you should have some amount of gold before you could issue that.
Yeah, so that would be, I think we would say that a fiat currency is a necessary but not sufficient condition for monetary sovereignty.
Yeah, definitely, because you must have the ability to do so. EU, for example, is a fiat currency system, but the countries that are members don't have monetary sovereignty, like France or Germany.
Right.
After the franc and the mark.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Please. So there was that fellow Beardsley Rummel who wrote in 1946. He was the former chair of the, I think, Bank of New York, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He said in 46, we no longer, taxes for revenue were obsolete in the sense that MMT says it, right?
Yes.
And the external gold standard, if you like, was there. I think, isn't it fair to say that that the internal gold standard was gone? That is the convertibility to gold. That was gone evermore after 1933, and therefore it was a fiat money system. And internally, the United States was a very definite issuer of its own currency, and much of what MMT says today was true then as well.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that if, for example, if you were to compare the United States situation of the United States in 1928 and the situation of the United States in, let's say, 1936, you would see a big difference. Because among other things, in 1928, when we were still on the gold standard, if, for example, the Bank of England raised interest rates there with the idea of attracting funds from other countries into England, there would be a movement of gold from the United States to the United Kingdom, and that movement of gold out of the United States would have a deflationary impact on the U.S. economy, so that the United States was could be adversely affected by the operations of the Bank of England and the British Treasury, and which indicates a certain degree of lack of monetary sovereignty. I very recently read a book on the creation of the Federal Reserve System, and this problem of the Bank of England raising interest rates, drawing gold out of the United States, and having a deflationary impact on the U.S. economy was very significant in, like say around the time of the crash of 1907.
Yeah, and I understand that France was always a bit of a bad actor that way too. They were always asking for gold, put a lot of pressure on nations in that regard.
I believe that is the case, but I don't know the specifics, so don't quote me on that.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on. Stephanie Kelton in this chapter uses two acronyms. One is spelled open parenthesis TAB close parenthesis S, and the second is capital S parenthesis TAB close parenthesis, and she uses these as shorthand for certain economic concepts. Let's see if we can get an explanation of these concepts. I still want to get some people who haven't spoken in this session. Vicky Mueller Olvera, would you like to take a stab at explaining Stephanie Kelton's use of the nomenclature tabs versus stab?
Okay, of course I would. First of all, I apologize. I couldn't speak last time. I was listening, but I couldn't talk. Okay, so anyway, a currency issuer like the federal government of our country spends before it can tax and borrow. But like me, I'm an individual and I have to, before I spend my money, like if I want to buy a car, she gives an example. If I want to buy a car, I can't do that. I don't have money, take it to the dealership, toss it down, ask them, hey, can I borrow money? That doesn't even make sense. So what she's saying is individuals have to come up with funding, have that in place before they can buy a house or like buy a car or something like that.
Okay. Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to comment on that. Let me call upon.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me? Pat Lowe, Patricia Lowe.
Okay,
I'm thinking of the used car dealer I might see a billboard for in a lower income neighborhood, which includes most of Philly. No money, no credit, not the drive your car home today. The dealer extends credit, I guess, at a high interest rate, or they work with a bank that extends credit, no money down deal. But I mean, that's where the bank is in there, allowing the spending before whatever, receipts. In the case of the individual homeowner, we're not talking about a government, but since you were talking about individuals like me and all that, that's why I made the comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Virginia, can you give us in your own words Stephanie Kelton's distinction between tabs and stab? Is Virginia there? Okay. Let's see. Trying to see if there's. Okay, Neil H.
Yeah, yeah, I would say similar. It was um, taxing and borrowing, then spending, versus spending and borrowing, then taxing. And it being the idea that the money for spending doesn't necessarily come from the taxes that they earn, and doesn't need to come from there first.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Okay, I think we can go on to the next question. What
Hey,
does it
Jim.
mean?
Jim, this
Hello?
is Ed. I just wanted to make, I think it's important to note that what Stephanie was trying to do was to explain the difference between conventional economic teaching and reality.
Okay.
That's what she stressed. I mean, her own, what she learned as a PhD student in economics was that we first have to be taxed. The government has to tax and borrow in order to spend, but the reality is exactly the opposite.
Yes.
That's what I was going to add.
Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. It
Yeah,
is important, of course.
The stabs and the tabs have to do with an understanding of government spending. It wasn't addressing individuals or users. It was the distinction between how people understand where the government gets its money and what's actually going on.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would add to that is that, of course, it's not that Stephanie Kelton learned the tabs thing when she was getting her PhD. This is the common notion that's in all the economics textbooks, and that is presumed in all public discussion. All senators and congressmen speak with that assumption. It's the conventional wisdom.
I should have said maybe from the time she had her first course in economics.
Yeah, yeah, yes. Of course, she was doing her PhD with Edward Nell, who's one of the members of the Board of Trustees of the Henry George School. So I assume that she got a bit better clarification of the nature of money and spending than she would have gotten from Ed Nell than she would have gotten in a reading a conventional economics textbook. I say that because I also studied with Ed Nell. Okay, let's see. All right, just to repeat the question, what does it mean for a government to provision itself? And I'm going to continue to try to find people who have not yet spoken. We're actually getting to the point where Norman Scott, can you take a stab at that question? What does it mean for a government to provision itself?
I just don't. Yeah, I don't remember that term. I'm just trying, but I could extrapolate. I mean, I'm just thinking.
Okay.
No, I don't think I could answer that. No.
Okay. Let's see. Did I call upon Mike Curtis yet? Mike Curtis?
I'm unmuting my microphone. I don't have a clue. I apologize.
Okay. Let's see. We have Patricia Lowe. Do you want to take an attempt at that question? What does it mean for the government to provision itself?
I haven't read the book yet, and I will be borrowing Philly Library.
Okay.
But I mean, I have a guess that somehow they got to raise taxes in order to spend, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, that can be a way, but we're looking for something a bit more general thing there. Let me
Can I,
let me let me try Tom Rossman. Is Tom Rossman there?
Yeah, I'm here. Provisioning itself means providing for its own funding to spend. So creating the funds to spend to fund government operations.
Okay, I think that's partially true, but there's a more general aspect to this, and I think that if you look in the book, um, probably between pages 24 and 26, you will find that Stephanie Kelton is quoting, is citing discussions that she's had with Warren Mosler, who's basically the godfather of MMT, and which he says when the government is provisioning itself, it's acquiring the goods and services that it needs to carry out what governments do. Whether they do that for good or evil doesn't really matter, but governments need to raise and provision armies, so they need to be able to provide for soldiers. They need to be able to provide ammunition. Governments generally have the responsibility for building roads and bridges, and they need to be able to acquire the supplies, the equipment, the raw materials to do that. So we're talking about the government provisioning itself. We're speaking in the most broad terms possible, something that we can apply to all governments throughout the history of human governments. And we're talking about an activity that the government engages in. We're not really specifying that it has to be done through money. Money is one of the ways, but a government could use corvée labor, for example. A government could use plunder. A government could seize resources in order to provision itself. Those are all ways of the government provisioning itself, and we'll see that that taxation has a very specific role in that.
Can I,
Norman? Yes.
Yeah. So it reminded me of the story about his kids, Mosler's kids, who wouldn't clean the house until he, in essence, created a tax for them. You have to pay me in he offered them money or his own fiat, and they wouldn't take it. But when he put them in a position where you got to give me 30 of these a week, they suddenly started doing work. So and he puts that in the context of the government provisions itself by creating a need for people to work and using the tax system as just one example of creating a need for people to work. Otherwise, they might not do it. It's almost like a weird reversal of things. The purpose of the tax is not to fund the government, but the purpose of the tax is to put people in a position where the work in the society will get done.
Yes. You got it.
Yeah, it triggered that story that he told, which was really interesting.
Yes, and I've actually used that same sort of exercise in classes, to and one of the little Warren Mosler catchphrases that comes from that is taxes drive the currency. In other words, the need to meet a tax obligation denominated in the currency specified by a particular government creates a demand for the things that you can do to get that currency to pay those taxes. So, okay. Let's see. Okay. Does this can be a tricky concept, and I just want to ask: does anybody uh, uh, in fact, I just sort of gave away the answer to the next question. The next question being, explain how the imposition of a tax drives demand for the currency in which the tax is to be paid. I think I think everybody has spoken at least once in either this week's class or last week's class at this point. So now I'd suggest raising your hand in the participants window to take a stab at answering this question. In the participants window, I see James Fredrickson's hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've read the sentence, the tax is there to create a demand for the government's currency about 20 times, and I still don't understand that.
Okay. Does anybody want to take a stab at responding to James's query about this?
Yeah. I think the idea of the provisions kind of clarifies that. I think Graeber makes a similar point, maybe clearer than this. A state or a government necessarily has to have things like a military and health services and things like that. Military is the easiest example. And it needs a way to incentivize people to partake in the military. One way in doing that is making people have taxes so that people have to acquire these taxes somehow, this money, that to pay for the taxes. And that's a way that they can fund the things they need, or they can not necessarily fund the military, but have the military, everything the other side of funding. So the labor and everything, all the resources. I don't know if I said that very clearly.
Okay.
One may also add that it's one of the ways by which a government or any entity can make a new currency acceptable. Like when apparently when Lincoln wanted to fund the war, he went to the bankers, they were asking a very high interest rate. And then a friend of his came and advised him, hey, you can create your own currency so you don't have to borrow. And then his question was, how will I get that new currency accepted? He said, well, just make sure that everybody pays their taxes in that currency. So how would they get that currency to pay tax? They have to work in order to pay the taxes.
Okay. I'm going to just go through the raised hands in the participants window. And particularly if we can, if you can address your remarks to what James Fredrickson's inquiries were about. Bonnie.
Yes, one thing that's very confusing about this issue is that it's claimed that paying taxes is an incentive. Well, if you're not making to create products, let's say, but if you're not making any products or doing anything, you wouldn't have to pay a tax. So that's a bit that confuses me about this issue. They're saying that taxes create, well, I can't remember the word for it. Well, production, sales, work, etc. But if you're not doing anything, you wouldn't owe any taxes. That's what confuses me.
I think, our idea of tax is very strongly shaped by the taxes that most of Americans or people in countries like America pay, which would be income and sales taxes. Let's just set aside sales tax for the moment. So we're talking about income tax, but income tax is merely one historical form of tax. To think about this in a way that is a bit more general, but also a bit more historic, think of what's called a head tax, which is a tax that is imposed on each household that has to be paid to the government, to the state, and it has to be paid. The state is not going to show any interest in whether you have income of your own to pay this tax, you have to pay the head tax. And
that's helpful. Yes.
okay. Now there are actual historical instances. Somebody mentioned David Graeber here, his very excellent book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. There's also illustrations in L. Randall Wray's primer on modern money theory, in which he cites what happened in British colonies in Africa in the 19th century, that where the British came in and they wanted to begin to basically extract wealth, to exploit the colonies. And they wanted to be able to, for example, hire residents of those African colonies like Nigeria for wage labor, which did not really previously exist in those countries. And they said, well, we'll pay you so many shillings or so many pounds sterling to perform this work. Well, those economies were not organized around shillings or pounds sterlings. So people said, well, what the hell do we want your pound sterlings for? We're happy. We use cowrie shells when we need to transact, but you won't take our cowrie shells. So then what the British did was they imposed a head tax and said every household has to pay a certain amount of tax in British currency. That created a demand for the British currency, and then the people had to figure out, well, how do we satisfy this demand? Well, one way to satisfy it was to actually go to work and get paid in sterling or shillings, something like that. So if you think about tax in a very general way, the concept of tax transcending particular forms of tax throughout history, then this becomes a bit clearer. Ed Dotson, you had a hand raised about this?
Well, I was going to extend what you just said to answer Jim Frederick's sort of concern, and that is, in the scenario you're talking about, let's go back to the feudal times and the introduction of coinage as money stamped by, whatever government. And up to that point, landowners and peasants, their relationship was a sort of reciprocity. You perform labor on the land that I own, and I take a share of your crop. Now money comes into the equation, and I'm the landowner who's forced to pay my taxes in coinage to the feudal lord. And so now I tell the peasant, I'm no longer going to take a share of your crop. You take what you grow into the marketplace and sell it, and then you pay your ground rent to me in cash so that I can pay my taxes to the new ruler. So a system that feeds on itself, and it has ever since.
Yeah. Joe Polito, you have your hand raised?
I do. It is, I understand why this statement is a bit confusing. And one way I like to look at it is the Incas, they ran an empire without money. They do it with direct authority, the emperor's authority. And there was a book by Felix Martin I think it was called The Biography of Money. And he talks about how money is one way of organizing a society. And a pretty darn good way, I think we've arrived at. But basically, money is kind of like distributed authority. I think someone mentioned that Aristotle called money a creature of the law. So the money is kind of an extension of the law. It gives you some control, a limited control over some resources. And if someone gives you some money, you have some control over some resources. And the government that uses money is giving people some control of the resources. And when they tax some back, they're taxing back some control of the resources. it's a, when I think of it in the Incas situation, it makes sense to me.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Let's see. I have one more hand raised, and then we'll move to the last several questions. Peter Lugton.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in the primitive situation where the government wants to start driving its currency and people didn't have any real need for the currency, so the government imposes a head tax that people have to pay in that currency. Another good thing that governments would have been able to tax at that sort of fundamental level would have been land site value.
Okay. Okay, they could do that as well. Okay.
That's it.
Okay, next question. Stephanie Kelton identifies 4 rationales for, in this case, federal taxation. Explain them in your own terms. Let's see, since I'm going to call upon Michael Leroyd. Can you explain at least one of Stephanie Kelton's rationales for taxation?
Well, the distribution of wealth, the manipulation of wealth, redistribution is one.
Okay.
I'm speaking from England, so I'm quite interested in your federal scenarios. We have we have our own eccentric ways of doing things over here. Perhaps that might be of interest to some people.
Yeah, I put that qualification in because, for those of us in the United States, we have the federal government, which is a currency issuing level of government, and we have the state and local governments, which are currency using that. So state and local governments are more similar to individual households or businesses in this sense than they are to the federal government. My understanding is that the United Kingdom has a much more centralized, at least within the components of the kingdom, like England versus Wales versus Scotland, has a much more centralized system than is present in the United States.
It appears to be just two. We pay our national taxes, but we also get taxed at a local level, et cetera, and that causes quite a. It's seen to be better in some ways that you can localize the the revenue needed for the local area instead of just resorting to national what should we say, national imperatives rather than local imperatives can be more you can understand them more and sympathize with them. If like I've got outside my front door, the roads need recovering, and we complain to the local authority for nothing happening, or the dust is collection, so that's paid out of local rates, etc. But it's I rather like that idea. Localize it, get it away from some central bureaucracy or quango dictating things all the time.
Okay. Okay, so one of the rationales for taxation is to affect the distribution of income and wealth. Let's call upon Lucas. Can you name another one of the rationales for taxation which Stephanie Kelton talks about?
Yes, Stephanie points out that it's used to fight inflation. An economy that's getting too hot, it could remove money from the economy.
Okay. So we now have two of the reasons that rationales for taxation identified by Stephanie Kelton. Let's see. Let's call upon Ed Dotson. Can you name another one of the rationales for taxation?
Sure. So that I have a higher income and you have a lower income.
Redistribution.
I won it in my favor, though.
Okay, that's shall we say, a sort of a skewed version of what Michael Leagoid identified. But I'm still looking for two others besides removing spending power from the non-government sector, thereby lessening inflationary pressures and facilitating redistribution of income and wealth. Two other things. David Johnson, can you identify one of the rationales for taxation?
Yes, the third one would be Pigouvian taxes.
The what?
Pigouvian taxes.
Okay. I sort of know what that term means, but maybe you can explain it for everybody.
Well, it's what we commonly refer to as a sin tax very often.
Okay.
Or, taxes which influence behavior or choices.
Right. Right.
Yeah, for instance, the idea today of a carbon tax.
A which tax?
The carbon tax, for instance.
Yes, that would be example. An example of such a tax that is already in operation is the cigarette tax, and that's actually had quite a bit of measurable impact.
Right.
Okay, and okay, and the other rationale for taxation that Stephanie Kelton mentions, which was actually the first one, and we sort of covered it already, is that taxation enables the government to provision itself without the use of explicit force. Okay? And it does so by the ways that we were discussing earlier, that the need to satisfy a tax obligation which is denominated in the currency issued by the government means that the people ruled by the government have to figure out how to obtain that currency, and that drives the demand for the currency, and the fact that the people have to engage in activity in order if they sell goods and services to the government, means that there is space in the productive sphere of that society for the government to provision itself. So, okay,
what we haven't mentioned really is one of the things. If you don't pay your taxes, they can lock you up. You know that they have power of government has powerful things to do.
Yes.
Can use, and so that can be quite a stimulating incentive not to be locked up in that way.
Yes,
it's there not is at all really.
Yeah, there is an element of coercion, but I think one of the points that Stephanie Kelton makes, at least implicitly, is that it's a much more reasonable form of coercion than, say, plundering the resources that the state needs. Last week, I saw the movie Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas, 1960, big Hollywood epic. The type of movie that fully matches the description. They sure don't make movies like that anymore. And the first scenes in Spartacus are of basically slave or corvée labor. Spartacus is a slave working in the mines of Libya. That was the Roman Empire provisioning itself by use of direct slave labor, much as, to a certain extent, governments today provision themselves by the use of prison labor. But that in the modern world, that wouldn't scale very well. And so we use the less coercive form of taxation. Okay, let's move from taxation to borrowing. Stephanie Kelton characterizes the U.S. federal government borrowing as a choice rather than as a necessity. Explain why. Let's see if Kuba, can you take a stab at this question?
Jim, I think I mentioned to you that about Cuba before the class starts.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Melvin Diaz, can you help us understand? Kelton characterizes U.S. federal government borrowing as a choice rather than a necessity. Why is that? Is Melvin Diaz there?
Yeah, the US government has got a lot of deficit when balancing the budget. And I'm not sure how they're going to solve this problem. Apparently, they're borrowing from other countries to run their country. So I don't know how that works.
Who is borrowing from other countries?
US government is borrowing money from the rest of the world to run USA.
Okay, well, I think that Stephanie Kelton would disagree with that statement. Let me call upon Ashley Kay. Can you help us understand why federal government borrowing is, in Kelton's opinion, a choice rather than a necessity?
Yeah, sure. So, I believe she said it's not necessary for the federal government to borrow because they could just issue or print the currency that they need to pay for what they want.
Yes.
And to be fair, I don't quite understand yet why they choose to borrow, but I think part of the reason is to give like US citizens and maybe other people like a safe investment opportunity with low yield, of course, as well. But I'm not sure I know all the reasons.
Okay, what you've said so far is absolutely correct. The issuance of federal debt obligations does provide people a safe, interest-bearing asset. It's a safe alternative. It's an interest-bearing alternative to cash that does not bear interest. If we go back several decades, many of you, at least many of you in the United States, will remember the times when checking accounts paid no interest. And if you wanted to get interest, you had to get a savings account, what would be called a time deposit, or a deposit like in New York State, they had community banks, savings banks, and savings and loan associations. And if you wanted to get a better interest rate, you went to the savings and loan association rather than the commercial bank.
No,
and your checking account at that time
difference between
paid paid no interest. Later, checking accounts began to pay interest, but it's at a very, very low rate. So one thing that it becomes possible with the issuance of federal debt is that it offers people and institutions a safe interest-bearing account. Now, that being said, the full MMT explanation as to why the federal government does issue bonds, why it does sell debt instruments, what we commonly call borrowing, is more complex. We'll get to it in subsequent weeks of this course, but the point that we will see in the coming weeks is that the government, because it is a currency issuing level of government, because it is monetarily sovereign, does not need to amass funds via taxation or borrowing before it can spend. That means that there must be other reasons why it chooses to engage in this activity that we've referred to as borrowing. We will also see that Stephanie Kelton characterizes the term borrowing when referred to, say, federal sale of treasury bonds as being somewhat misleading or inadequate terminology. So I'm not.
Can I ask a question?
Pardon me?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's like a brief comment as to the guy who was Diaz or somebody was saying that the other governments hold US government debt. And, I think China holds a lot of government bonds. Like, I don't know if they're one of the largest holders. I mean, my guess as to why the US would be selling debt all over the world is maybe to keep the governments close to us. Now, I don't know if that will work in the case of China, because I think China would love to have the renminbi be the worldwide current reserve currency. But that was just a comment. I appreciate your view.
Well, actually, what Patricia, your comment anticipates the subject of, I believe, Chapter 5 in the deficit myth, and because one of the deficit myths is that because other countries hold large amounts of U.S. Treasury debt, that they have some sort of stranglehold over the fate of the U.S. economy or the future policies of the U.S. government. Kelton would characterize that as a myth, and she would say that because the United States wants to buy a lot of goods and services from China, and the United States pays for those goods and services in dollars, that as long as the United States keeps buying goods and services from China, China is going to be accumulating dollars, and China can either hold those dollars simply as dollars, or they can purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, for example. They have exactly the same motivation, a safe, interest-bearing asset, which is an alternative to cash. So that the motivations by which China might hold large quantities of U.S. Treasury bonds are no different from yours or mine, or any Citibanks or Chase Manhattans. It's the safe alternative. Okay. Today I reread Chapter 1 of the Deficit Myth, and I realized that there was one additional topic that Stephanie Kelton covers there that I had not originally added to the list of discussion questions. So I only added it to the list in the Slack channel a couple hours ago, but I'd like to toss this question out anyway. Stephanie, and here anybody, just raise your hand, we'll take the first caller. Stephanie Kelton criticizes what are called the pay-go rules, which the U.S. Congress imposes on itself. What are these rules, and why does Stephanie Kelton take issue with them? I see some hand raised in the participants window. William Batt, would you like to, did you get to that part of the meeting?
Yeah, I had another comment to make, but I can respond to this.
Sure.
Pay-go is a term frequently used right now with respect to lots of medical policies, particularly those that are underwritten or partially underwritten by government. It's pay as you go. In other words, there's no advanced insurance or any other provision. It's just pay as you go. And there are other services that might be provided by government or quasi-government agencies that also would require pay as you go. Roads, for example.
Okay. As a matter of fact, you are correct that that is one use of the term pay-go. I believe that Stephanie is pointing to a slightly different use of the term paygo. Let me see. Uh, Bonnie, would you like to take a stab at answering that?
Well, I think she says that all of these curbs on spending that Congress puts through uh, are just political cover for their own personal politics, and that they don't really mean anything because the government can spend what it wants. I mean, obviously, look at the military. If they want the money, they got it.
Right.
But so these the pay-go and these other, curbs on spending as a political ploy to hide their own politics.
Okay.
That's my recollection. Yeah.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is there are several people have their hands raised in the participants window, and since we have 10 minutes left in our allotted time, I'd just like to call on them. And so if you can if you either make your comment or question brief, that would be good. Let's call upon Oliver Liu.
My understanding of PAYGO is she's saying anytime something has to be paid in the budget, it has to be offset by, increased taxes or decreased spending elsewhere, which again,
Right.
sort of like the previous person was saying, it's kind of political cover because the general public is assuming the household sort of model for the economy. But if you take the MMT model, you don't have to balance the budget. So there's absolutely no reason for engaging in that kind of process.
Okay. Navarre.
I was just gonna say we talked a lot earlier about how we want to trying to encourage people to do work based on the taxes, and that reminded me of something I'd read. I was able to find where I read it. I was in philosophy of public finance. Mason Gaffney actually talks about how that's a function of the land value tax. He says, which I shall call social auditing. The landholder is regarded as a trustee, providing over resources in which the community has a paramount sovereign interest. Each year, a payment is assessed against him based on the capacity of the land to serve society. The demand for this payment is a kind of social audit, a way of asking the biblical question, what have you done with the talents with which we have entrusted you? And so that's kind of getting close, I think, to like the MMT idea. Maybe it's not quite MMT, but it's the idea that it's like a certificate that the government has an interest in work getting done when you hold something important. And so that's why they want the money, to show that you, not because they need money, not because they need dollars, but to prove that you actually did something constructive.
Very, very interesting parallel there. Let's see, Bonnie.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the former thing about the bond holders or issuing the treasuries. Something I didn't understand. What she said at the end of the chapter is that what the government didn't collect in taxes, the difference between what they collect in taxes and their deficit, that difference is what they would issue in treasuries. And she didn't explain why. And that's my only comment. I mean, I wrote that down, but I didn't understand why she was saying that because there was no explanation.
Well, I'll have to look that up. Now, let me just mention that that's the sort of question that I would urge you to put into the Slack channel for this course. The Slack application, Henry George Slack application. There's a channel in that specifically for this course called "Do Deficits Really Matter?" That sort of question you can put in there, and I take a look at that several times over the course of the week, and I can probably give you a better answer after thinking about it for a bit than I can off the top of my head right now.
Thank you. The problem I have with Slack is that my operating system doesn't support it. And so, well, anyway, too bad
okay.
for me. Yes.
Okay. Norman Scott. You had a hand raised?
Yes, I think that the pay-go, and she mentions the bird rule, and I think that she exposes the myth that the Democratic and Republican Party are somehow at opposite ends of the spectrum, and she fundamentally ties them both into the same system. They both have the same belief, but the Republicans have it come from one way, and the Democrats come from it. Oh, let's raise the taxes on the rich, and which she really puts down that we have to pay for it by raising someone's taxes. And I think that it's very pertinent to a lot of the issues today, whether it's student debt. I mean, you think about it, everyone's, saying, oh, how can we relieve all this student debt? Well, obviously the government could do that at the stroke of a pen. And the other issue is people like Manchin and others. Well, how are you going to pay for medical care? How are you going to pay for this? But they've just given $5 billion to Ukraine. I didn't hear one pay-go. I mean, where did that money come from?
You noticed that?
Yes, not one word from Manchin, even from the people on the commentators. You don't hear a word about it. But if you should, God forbid, mention eyeglasses for the elderly, we want to know how we're going to pay for that. I think it exposes the crucial problem. And she even mentioned when she was on that committee hired by Bernie Sanders, even Bernie didn't raise fundamental issues in those hearings. And I think that's a real exposure of the entire political system in these 3 pages, I think, of a book.
Norman, I'm going to ask you to hold those thoughts, particularly for the last session of this course, when we get to chapters 7 and 8, where, Stephanie Kelton really lays out her analysis of the political situation. I want to just mention, since we only have a couple minutes left, that next week, week 3, the reading assignment is chapter 2, which is called Think of Inflation. So, the title of chapter 1 is Don't Think of a Household. Title of chapter 2 is Think of Inflation. Now, the chapter is not entirely about inflation, but it's about a lot of things. It's probably the most challenging chapter in the book. So please try to work through those discussion questions. The discussion questions are already up on the website at learner-minsky.org, and after the class, I will be copying and pasting them into the Slack channel for you to go over there. Now, I believe, let's see, William Batt, did you have your hand raised? If we can.
I did. It was just a minor correction, perhaps.
Okay.
I spent a good part of my life in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. And the way in which you use the word corvée implied some kind of a stigma to it, perhaps like slavery. Not at all. Corvée was a way for the farmers, particularly, to pay for their maintenance of the canals and the roads, and they also paid food to the monks, and this was also contribution to the royalty, which in many cases were regarded as gods. So corvée was for everyone. It was not a tribute or a contribution only to the royalty. It was a contribution to the society.
That's very interesting. I'll take your correction. I was introduced to the concept of corvée labor in an Asian studies class, but that was in high school, which was more than half a century ago.
That's okay.
So I could well have been mistaken. Okay, we're closing in on 8 o'clock, so at least 8 o'clock Eastern time. So please read chapter 2 for next week, work through the discussion questions, and put your questions in the Slack channel, specifically in the Do Deficits Really Matter portion of the school, because that Slack application has other channels that are for other aspects of the Henry George School. But the one for this course is, do deficits really matter? Any last questions for this evening?
Yeah, where are the discussion questions listed on the website? I don't see how they're identified. I'm looking at the Lerner Minsky thing.
Okay.
And,
And do you see a link there called resources?
No.
Can you place in the?
I'm under parent directory. Let me refresh the page and maybe it's not. I've got Mosler Green interview excerpt, Mosler Mike Green transcript, campaigns, conferences, functional finance scoreboard, and BGSS. HGSS, is that it?
That's us, Henry George School of Social Science. You just click on that, and then you'll see there's the various courses that I've taught, and then within there, look for a course. It'll probably say something like 202204 course or 22.
Okay, I see that. I
spring
see that.
Course, and then you see week 1, week 2, week 3.
Yes, I've got it. I see
Okay.
it. And then below that, you have 2 different presentation things. That's something else. Our course is that. Go ahead.
No, what that is after we exit the Zoom meeting, what I do is I post a PDF of the talk that I gave at the beginning of tonight's session.
Okay.
That will be up there, like within an hour. And but the discussion questions for each week are already up there. So you can read Stephanie's book at your own pace, and you can work through the discussion questions at your own pace.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, Ibrahima, if you have any remarks to take us out, otherwise we'll say good evening.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good discussion.